It's an enormous pleasure to welcome you today. And after the incredibly fascinating, challenging, and difficult conversations of yesterday, today we're shifting register and we're going to move from the diagnosis and begin to explore what needs to be done to ensure that all of us can collaborate, can work together to achieve the ambitious goals of the SDGs.
During the revolution, I really learned how to own my narrative, because we made the news until we became the news. No one believed us at the start. In fact, many called us troublemakers, and we had to shift that narrative to get the support we need. So we documented our own story, and that's how even blogging and citizen journalism also emerged. I started a blog called Proudly Tunisian precisely to challenge mainstream narrative, including the naming of the Arab Spring, which I find very problematic, and we can discuss in the Q&A. But I think, like many young people, I found power in my voice, because that is our struggle. We are a generation of no perfect wording, a generation that doesn't use simple data in a complicated language. So I sometimes wonder, why are we making the work of development so freaking complicated? Why can't we just allow young people to reimagine development, to express its narrative differently than poverty eradication or economic growth? Because if we really want ownership of the SDGs, it has to start from Africa's narrative about SDGs. We need to start asking ourselves, are we contributing to narratives of empowerment or disempowerment? Including narratives about young people. There are currently two ways the development sector talks about young people: as beneficiaries of youth development or participants in youth-led development. So it's often not clear whether, as a group, African youth are portrayed as the problem or the solution. And I think the first step to youth empowerment is to change that narrative, that young people are drivers, not subject of development. Because narratives become a place of belonging and identity to many, and a lot of young people internalize that narrative, and that's why we see a lot of young people die in the Mediterranean and a lot of young people go into violent extremism. And that's a different conversation, but narratives are extremely important of how we portray ourselves and how we own it and how we express ourselves to the world as young people. I think Africa's narratives on SDGs should be owned by Africans in our own words, and no one should rewrite our stories for us or express what SDGs for us are, and no one should reimagine the Africa we want but us. And I think that is the lesson we learned as a movement as well.
The starting point must be that a sustainability transition is not equal to decarbonization. A sustainability transition is a much wider transformation of the economy. I would like to use the word economic transformation. However, renewable energy is the lead sector of this transformation. If we can get the investments in renewable energy going to scale, and we leapfrog over the fossil fuel age, and we resist the temptation to sink in concrete the technologies of the 19th and 20th century, and we choose to leap into the 21st century, that would then generate the kinds of surpluses and capacities that would be required to deal with the other sustainability challenges, such as soil degradation, water, depleting water resources, biodiversity degradation, more sustainable building materials that are not so cement-based. In the African continent, we think success is about living in cement, but that's not very sustainable. And mobility, alternative forms of mobility, mass transit, etc. But many of these issues, these challenges, are quite long-term, whereas the renewable energy transition can actually happen quite quickly.
When we think about Africa, we are thinking about people. The people make the place. Africa is the people. And the definition or the interpretation associated with Africa emerges from very, very loose understandings of what Africans do on the continent collectively. So if we want to brand the continent, if we want to change that narrative and make it more conducive to development, we start by investing in people. So to brand a continent is to take a people-centric approach to sustainable development. This is whereby our policymakers, our businesses across the continent, and other organizations are investing particularly in women and the vulnerable young people. There has been a discussion particularly raised by the previous speakers, where they've been focusing on the troubles or the marginalization of women and young people. Yet these people, they are important and critical value creators. We have very hardworking African women, we have very hardworking young people who are mostly employed in informal sectors because they lack the education, because there's no access to employment for these particular demographic groups. So if we are looking at the continent as the people, yet at the same time excluding particular demographics, it makes very, very challenging for us to develop as a continent.
Women, youth, and the disabled. By bringing in these groups into the economy, we can get new ideas, because these are people who have not participated before to the extent that is possible. And therefore, by tapping into that opportunity, not only do we get more sustainable poverty reduction and sustainable outcomes in terms of climate, but we get new ways of thinking and new ways of doing, because these groups who are previously excluded can come in with those new ideas. I saw, for example, by trying to think about how do you give access to people who are moving on wheelchairs, gives benefits not only for the disabled group, but also for people who are on bicycles, or mothers who are having their children on perambulators. So those are some of the examples where, by bringing in new ideas, you can solve problems in multiple ways.
Justice is what love looks like in public, just like tenderness is what love looks like in private. Very deep messages of how society should allow itself to move to being, and allow that being to direct its action come out. One of the key messages that come out from that understanding of what justice is that this is pegged on unarmed truth. Truth that is not tempered by any societal culture norms. It is just truth that is going into the deepest places, such that the structure of the mind that is governing at every level, the structure of the mind that is utilizing power at every turn in our lives, becomes deeply analyzed by this openness to understand what love looks like, and therefore what the truth really is about selling weapons to a country when you actually advocate in all your policies that you are anti-trafficking in humans. The interlinks are there. If you were to choose to go into truth as any person in power, institution in power, you would see this glaringly, and you would stop pretending that there is no linkage in all the woes that we are creating for ourselves. And coupled with the truth is therefore that unconditional and untempered love, which makes us to go into action.
I'm basically very optimistic after all these years, because There's no new technology needed to solve these problems. These terrible problems are not acts of God or bad luck. They're a political choice. And the cost of eradicating these problems is often said to be huge, but actually there's lots and lots of resources and money in the world. For example, to provide every person on the planet with basic healthcare and adequate nutrition is the equivalent of what Europeans spend on dog and cat food. To provide, if all the money that American people in North America spent on pizza every year was given to the poor in Africa, extreme poverty would disappear. We're not talking about vast sums of unreasonable money that needs to be transferred. It's not a lack of money that these problems are, it's the political will. There's trillions and trillions of dollars hidden in the Cayman Islands and Swiss bank accounts doing nothing. Since the 1980s, in the neoliberal era, we've seen policies which have meant the rich get richer and richer, narrow 1% or less than 1%, and a lot of the rest of the world stay the same or even get poorer. This is leading us towards a world of mass poverty, growing poverty, and mass damage. There needs to be the political will to reverse those policies and have a bit more redistribution both within and between countries. I'm not talking about all the money from rich countries going to poorer countries. I'm talking about pizza budgets, dog and cat food budgets. That's the scale of the problem. It's not, you don't need to be some radical Marxist lunatic to want to advocate these things. We're talking about small changes to the current world we have.
Through the Africa Finance Sector Hub, established in South Africa in 2019, UNDP is working to collaborate with the University of Cape Town Bertha Foundation, which produced the first ever SDG investor map in Africa, leading to identification of 30 investment opportunity areas that tackle unemployment, inequality, and poverty. We look forward really to deepening this collaboration and partnership, because that's the kind of action that it will take for us to get there. No one entity is going to be able to navigate this very complex and challenging policy route that we're faced with. We need more research directly related to solutions to Africa's challenges, and we must enable African countries, scholars, and institutions to take ownership of their development.